simulate again. And you can see now that the reach is a bit more leisurely. So now we want to move around and zoom in a little so we can take a look at the point where his hands reach the bar. So somewhere there should be good. Now if we simulate, we can see by default the hands are reaching close to the centre of that bar. What we want to do is put a little bit of spread between those hands so that this hand reaches further in this direction and this hand reaches further in this direction. So to do that, we can select the hands reach and look at behaviour event again and move to its property view. If we scroll down under left hand target, there are various properties for offsets of that interception point, and we want the offset in X, which represents this direction here. If we change that value from 0 to 0.3, that means that the character's left hand will now reach 0.3 meters in the positive X direction, which is along here. So for the right hand target, we want the character's hand to reach in the negative X direction along here to spread it out a little. So we'll move down to the same property for the right hand, and we'll change that to minus 0.3. Now if we run the simulation, you can see that the character reaches slightly wider than he did initially and makes contact with the bar. So at about this point we want the character to grab onto the bar and swing from it. To do that we're going to use a constraint. So let's go to the character's timeline and right click and select create constraint event. And let's make that constraint event begin at roughly this point, which is in fact frame 109. Let's stretch that all the way out to the end of the timeline. And then I'm going to Alt right click in the timeline, which allows me to zoom and expand that timeline. This now allows me to drag this constraint event out to about frame 400. Now let's select the constraint event in the timeline and move to its property view, and under target objects we want to click select, and you can see that by default the character's pelvis is selected as a target for this constraint event. The constraint itself is of type lock, and what that will do is simply lock whatever is selected in space. And we want to select the hands as a target for this constraint. You may need to rotate and zoom to select the hands. And if you move out of selection mode as you're rotating or zooming, simply move back to the constraints property view and click select again. And then you can left click on one hand and then control left click on the other and right click anywhere in the viewport. Now if we move back to a position where we can see the animation. So now if we look at the simulation, you can see that the character jumps, grabs the bar and swings. But if we move in a little and take a closer look at his hands, you'll see that actually they're locked in space. And what we would like to see them do is to swing a bit more around this bar. This bar is laying along the x-axis. We can do that by selecting the constraint event in the timeline, going to its property view, and in the angular strength value change it to 0, and that will relax the constraint along the x-axis so that the hands are able to rotate. So now let's take a look at the simulation again, and this time you can see that the hands are much more relaxed in X and they actually swing and rotate a little with the rest of the character. So now let's move out again, and you can see that as the character grabs the bar and swings, he looks a little lifeless, a little ragdoll like. Now we want to add a bit more interest to that animation by getting him to kick his legs. We can do that with another behaviour event. So if we go to the character's timeline and right click, select create behaviour event, we can slide that along to begin at the end of the hands reach and look at behaviour, which is frame 112, and we'll extend it to finish at frame 400 along with the constraint. Now we'll change that behaviours type to legs kick 2.0 and simulate again. And you can see that now the character reaches for the bar, and as he grabs it and swings, his legs writhe about to give the animation a bit more realism. So you can see how it's possible to combine various different behaviours in sequence to get a realistic animation, and of course by changing the parameters and timings of these events you can end up with a huge variety of different motions.